Om Stapakaya च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः. So we are continuing our discussion on Buddhism, especially Shunyavada of Nagarjuna. So those of you who have studied Vedanta philosophical systems earlier should keep in mind that the one fundamental basic difference between Shunyavada or Buddhism in general and Vedanta systems is that Buddhists believe in the doctrine that there is no Atman. Technically it is called Nairatmyavada. The term was used by philosophers who wrote books on different systems of Indian philosophy and their evolution, like Sarvadarsana Sangraha and other books. So it's called Nairatmyavada, meaning the doctrine that there is no Atman. And as part of it, there is another doctrine, that is the doctrine or the theory of momentariness, Kshanabhangavada. Kshana means moment. So everything comes into existence and ceases to exist in a Kshana. The smallest conceivable unit of time. So everything is momentary and there is no such thing as an Atman, as something that remains all the time permanent. So this is the central principle. Of course, when we study the original work of Nagarjuna, that's the most prominent system, that is Shunyavada of Nagarjuna, is the most well-known doctrine of the later schools of Buddhism compared to Sautrantikas and Vaibhashikas or even Vijnanavadis, which is also very prominent. Nagarjuna seems to be the most prominent philosopher in Buddhist tradition ever since Buddha passed away. Now, one important point that frequently quoted again and again, one of the most often quoted verses from Buddhist tradition is taken from Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika. And in fact, this Madhyamika Karika has got only one well-known Tiga or commentary, Prasanna Pada by Chandrakirti. He was also a very great teacher of Shunyavada. And of course, there are a few conflicting views between different schools of Shunyavada, later Shunyavada, Prasangika school and Swatantra school, that we will discuss in course of time. Chandrakirti is the great teacher who explained in his own style the central teachings of Mula Madhyama Shastram. So one important verse that is frequently quoted in most of serious discourses on Buddhism is, it comes in the 24th chapter of Mula Madhyama Shastra, and it's called Arya Satya Pariksha, examination of noble truths. Now, Chatwari Arya Satyani, these four noble truths. And that's a cornerstone, the foundation of Buddhism, which is common to all the different systems of philosophy, both the Hinayana and also Mahayana systems. And the well-known verse is this, Dve Satye Samupasitya Buddhanam Dharma Deshana Loka Samvriddhi Satyamcha Paramarthataha. So a very well-known verse. So what Nagarjuna states is very, very simple. The central teachings of Buddha are founded on two basic principles, two great truths. One is Loka Samvriddhi Satyam, that is empirical truths, what Vedanta is called Vyavaharika truths, the world and all these things we come and go, which are all included in the Praditya Samutpada framework. and then Satyam cha Paramarthadaka, and the ultimate truth. Now, you can very easily relate these two levels of reality with the Paramarthika Vyavaharika equation in Shankaracharya's Vedanta system, which again is based on Upanishads. Now, in Vedanta tradition, as we all know, external objects are real, but not absolutely real, because they are subject to time. They come into existence in time, they exist in time, and they disappear in time. And they are perceived differently in the waking, dream, and deep sleep states. And they are also subjected to the 6 changes which originally Yaska outlined in the 6th century BC work called Niruktam, which is actually like a dictionary. Is the commentary on the Veda Vaidya Nikhandu, which now it is the first study for any serious student of Vedic literature, Yaska's Niruktam. So according to that, anything that is subjected to 6 changes, that is, coming to existence is a change, because birth is nothing but a change of transition from empirical non-existence into empirical existence, then existing, then growing, evolving, going through decay and disappearance. Jayade, asti, vadhade, viparinamade, apakshiyade, vinashyati, like that. It's called technically in Sanskrit Vedantic language. Now, this Samvriddhi Satyam, what Nagarjuna calls Samvriddhi Satyam, that is the truth or reality with regard to worldly convention, with regard to empirical phenomenal world, that is Loka Samvriddhi Satyam. And then Paramartha Satyam. And what is the Paramartha Satyam? And Nagarjuna calls it Shunya. Now that Paramartha Satyam is Shunya according to Nagarjuna, and according to other Vedantins it is Bodhi, Vijñapti Matrata Siddhi is a well-known book. So in many of the works of the Mahayana school, both Vijñanavadins and Shunyavadins, they are talking about the Vijñapti or Vijñana. And that is the reality that exists. Then that reality is Shunya according to Nagarjuna. So it's very obvious that Nagarjuna did not mean by the word Shunya what we now understand, but is wrong English translation as emptiness or nothingness. So there's a big danger in understanding. Many serious philosophers who studied Upanishads, Vedanta systems and Buddhism, they conclude that Buddha never meant to refute the existence of one supreme unchanging reality. This is a very important thing. Now, after Chandrakirti, after reading this, he has his own contributions to make in his Tika. It's called Prasanna Pada Tika. It's his commentary. That's the only well-known commentary on Madhyamika Shastra. Chandrakirti's Prasanna Pada. We translated into all Far Eastern languages like Cambodian, Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, much earlier in ancient times. So the verse is, as I mentioned, Dve Satye Samupasritya Buddhanam Dharma Deshana Loka Samvriddhi Satyam cha Paramarthadaka. Chandrakirti, he in his commentary makes a very profound statement. Remember, Chandragirti as his rivals, even while in interpreting the central thesis of Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika. So his school of thought is known as Prasangikas. Anyway, so Swadhantrikas is a different school. So Chandragirti says, Samaptam cha idam madhyamaka shastram. He says, now the Shunyavada philosophy, Madhyama Shastram, is concluded here. Samaptam cha idam madhyamaka shastram sakala laukika lokottara pravachana nida neyartha vyakhyana naipunya visharadam. So that's what he says. So he says, the central teachings of Madhyamika Karika, Mula Madhyama Shastram, is concluded here. And he says it is Sagala Laugika Lokottara Pravachana Nida Neyartha Vyakhyanam. So it describes and expounds two levels of realities. One is Nida, the absolute, the final, the conclusive, that is Nida. Neyartha means the Vyavakarika, the empirical. Because you transcend the empirical, the Samvriddhi Satyam, then you reach Paramartha Satyam, which is Shunya. It's also stated here. You transcend Samvriddhi and then you attain Paramartha Satyam. Pravachana, Nida, Neyartha, Vyakhyana, Naipunya, Visharadam. Now what this shows is, I'm reading this to make a few points very, very clear. In fact, as I mentioned, this is, as it happened, is so well known and one of the most oft-quoted verses in this text. Now remember this, according to Buddhist philosophers, Buddha was strongly against any kind of dogmatic approach in philosophy, and he was openly opposed to any kind of idea that this is the only thing, there cannot be anything else. So actually, this idea that the absolute reality should be something which is not binary, which has got the scope for different interpretations. So that idea was again and again stressed by Buddha, not as a doctrine, but in his conversational style. So when he put a question to them, and when they answered, then if he found that there is a binary approach, we call it fanatical approach in modern times, Buddha openly opposed it. So that is in fact the same idea. The idea is repeated in the 15th chapter. It's called Sabhava Pariksha, examination of one's own essential nature, self-nature. Astidi shashvata graho nastidi uchcheda darshanam tasmat astitva nastitve nasriyada vichakshanaha. Buddha's approach to the ultimate truth and philosophy are fully reflected in this profound statement of Nagarjuna. Astidi shashvata graho nastidi uchcheda darshanam. That is, existing, something is existing or exists. It is shashvata graha, means it is an implication of something, the idea that something is permanent. So if you use the word asti alone, of course this is the language of the Buddhist. If you say asti, then you are implying that there is something that exists, E capital letter, let's say, and it never ceases to exist. So that could be the implication of the word asti, existing. So you have to use capital letter E, that. So the Shashvata Graha, I mean, there's an implication that something is eternal. Shashvata means eternal. And the Nasti the Uchcheda Darshanam. If you say it doesn't exist, then it borders on some kind of, annihilation or nihilism. So, and Buddha was against that. That's why Nasti the Uchcheda Darshanam. Uchcheda means annihilation. So again that emphasis on the rejection of Chatuskodis, 4 prepositions where we discussed elaborately. It comes in the first 2 verses, the introductory verse called the dedicatory verse of Madhyamika Shastram, and also the first verse of Madhyamika Shastram. You find there the idea that the truth cannot be called asti, existing, or nasti, non-existing, because one implies the possibility of something eternal, the other implies something that borders on the possibility of something totally non-existent or annihilation. So he says, Tasmat astitva nastitve na asriyeda vijakshanaha. Therefore, a discerning spiritual seeker should not rely upon either existence or non-existence. Now, this is the language they used. Asti yathi sabhavena natad nasti shashvatam nastidanim abhuda purvam iti uchcheda prasishyate. So whatever that is existing in terms of nature, that is not non-existent, implies eternalism. So neither eternalism nor annihilation, the opposite of eternalism. Eternalism is a word frequently used only in this context. It may not be agreeable to English language experts, So the doctrine, the tendency to attribute eternal nature, immortality to anything. Now here again, then why do you call Paramartha Paramarthika Satyam? Just now, we already read just now, the central teachings of Buddha can be classified into 2 categories. One is Loka Sampurti Satyam, the other is Paramartha Satyam. And according to Nagarjuna, the Paramartha Satyam is Shunya. So when Nagarjuna says that it is Paramartha Satyam, it is only Satyam, only reality which cannot be limited within the framework of any definition, description or anything. But in other words, when you attain Nirvana, through realizing Shunyada, you are experiencing something which is beyond explanation. So that takes you very close to Advaita. That is central thesis of Advaitins. So even Sri Ramakrishna, in very, very simple language, when he says the same thing, people sometimes don't understand the profoundness of the seriousness of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings because it is put in simple language. He says, for example, if you want to understand what milk is like, what sugar is like, then certainly you have to taste sugar. You have to eat sugar and understand its taste. You cannot explain sugar if it's God speaking for 2-3 hours, or if you write a thesis, you cannot explain sugar. Sugar is something that only be experienced. And see, Sri Ramakrishna says Brahman is the only thing that has not been digested by anyone, that is not being eaten by anybody, because it cannot be touched by mouth. What it means is, it cannot be spoken of, it cannot be explained, it cannot be defined. That idea. So Nirvana is nothing but an experience. Experience of Shunyata. And that is nothing but the inner experience of the reality of the fundamental impermanence of everything in this world. And as a consequence of that, you realize one supreme reality which again beyond description. So that's why there is a strong refutation of Shashwatagraha, and also there is a strong refutation of Uchcheda Darshanam. First of all, the idea that there is something that is eternal is refuted, and the idea that there is something that is totally, absolutely non-existent is refuted. This, in fact, the idea comes very prominently in the second verse. Actually, it's the first verse. The second verse is the first verse. The first verse in Madhyamaka Shastra is a kind of what you call Ubodghata, or dedicatory verse. Nagarjuna is dedicating this book to the highest spiritual truth. The second verse is very, very important here, and that's also very well quoted. It is na soto napi parado na dvabhyam napi ahetukaka utpannam jadu vidyande bhava koja kechana. That's how this text begins, Mula Madhyama Shastra. It begins like this. Na soto napi parato na dvabhyam napi ahetukaka utpanna jadu vidyante bhava kochana kechana. So, there is no evidence that there is anything that is existing, or existence whatsoever are not evident anywhere. And kojana kechana, there is no proof to show that all these empirical things are really existing. So here existing should be understood as something that is eternal all the time. And again, either something that is born of itself, that is soto parato vapi, anything that comes into existence from itself, or anything that is coming into existence from some other source. There is no such thing in this world. So, utpanna jadu vidyanti bhava kojana kechana. Now, one may very well wonder how Advaitins look upon this. So, I mentioned earlier, those who studied Vedanta will find it easy to understand the actual position of Buddha about Buddhist philosophy if you look at from Vedantic perspective. So I have to keep in mind one important principle. What we read in modern translations, which equate Nagarjuna's Shunyatvam or Shunyada to absolute nothingness, absolute emptiness, as understood in English language, that is wrong. It is again the problem of language. The word Shunya in Buddhist philosophy has a meaning which may be different from what it means in Oxford or Chambers Dictionary. That is true. A word can have one meaning, one fixed implication in a philosophical system. That word may mean something different when you use it in popular literature. And that's the source of words which are described, which meanings are given in the dictionaries, lexicons. So to understand this, they say how Advaita and Yogacara compares and how Advaita and Shunyavada combines. To begin with, let's say how Advaita and Shunyavada combines. In Brahmasutra Bhashya, Shankaracharya deals with this problem. Remember what we discussed just now, what we mentioned just now, that Nagarjuna Shunya is not absolute nothingness as understood in English language. That was not the popular impression prevalent in India when Shankaracharya wrote this commentary in 8th century. We are right now interpreting Nagarjuna's system after comparing all available sources. Chandrakirti's Prasannapada was not so well known. It had not become popular during Shankaracharya's time. What was popular was the teachings of Yogacharas, that is called Pravritti Vijnana, the latest school of Yogacara, who denied the existence of anything. And also Shunyavada, who denied that there is anything. So they did not even insist on Shunya as some kind of a transcendental reality, which very clearly Nagarjuna says, Loka samvriddhi satyam cha paramarthadaha. So Nagarjuna very clearly says there is one absolute truth, paramartha satyam. Vedanta also says there is paramartha satyam, this is Brahman. So Nagarjuna says, but that idea was not popular, or it was not clearly articulated by scholars of Buddhism in the 8th century. So Shankaracharya, refuting the popular idea of Shunyavada in his time, 8th century, which was that Shunya means, that's called Shunya means absolute nothingness. Kshanika, they were called Vainashika. Vainashika literally means somebody who destroys everything, who annihilates everything, who believes in annihilation as the ultimate doctrine. That is the real meaning of, and they are called Mahavainashika, the great annihilator sometimes. So that should be kept in mind. So there is one sutra in the Brahma Sutra, Anusmurdescha. It is in the 2nd chapter, 2nd pada, 25th sutra. Anusmurdescha. So the idea is, if everything is momentary and everything is absolute nothingness, then how do we remember things? Everything comes into existence in every fragment of time, every fragment of a second comes into existence and disappears, and there is nothing. Now, if that is so, how do we remember? So, Anusmurdescha. So, the idea is there is one absolute unchanging reality, but it doesn't change with the changing empirical phenomena. Why? Anusmurdescha. Because we remember certain things that we experienced in the past. So remembrance implies that we existed, the X, let's say X. X existed when an event took place. And today that X, the person X, remembers that incident that happened to him, let's say a year ago, maybe yesterday or any time. So there is a connecting bridge between the time when it happened and the time when it is remembered. For that there should be a single entity, and that entity should be the same. That person, the A, experienced it, and that same A remembers it today. If everything is Kshanika, Kshanabhangavad, as I mentioned, everything comes into existence and disappears, momentariness. If everything is momentary and if there is nothing that really exists, Shunyavada, then how do you explain what is experienced by everyone? The ability to remember the past events, even if when you remember, for example, you, and this is perhaps most evidently experienced in learning music. So when you learn music, great students, good students can play music after listening only once. Of course, great students, not many, but good at that, either vocal or instrumental. You listen to music, instrumental, and then if there are many prodigies who do that, and they are able to, not many, but many, there are several people who have this ability. And they'll grasp just once. And he listened to a music teacher in the morning, and in the evening he plays that. So who retains his memory? So there's a connecting bridge. If you believe in Shunyavada, or momentariness, emptiness and momentariness, then you should not be able to remember anything. So Shankaracharya's one well-known argument is the very phenomenon of memory, human memory, is a clear refutation of the doctrine of Buddhism. As popular during his time, it is called the doctrine of emptiness or annihilation. So this is a very important point, remember. So he says, Apicha vainasikaka sarvasya vastunaga kshanikadam abhyupayan uparabdhu api kshanikadam abhyupeyat. This is a complicated language. So he says, Vainasika means somebody who believed in Shunyavada. It can be extended to Vijnanavadins also, because they also denied the existence of anything. So if you accept them, who tell you that not only the subject but also the object, not only the object but also the subject. You listen to music or you saw something, that object no longer exists, but the person who saw the object also doesn't exist. If that is so, how can a person remember what he experienced in the morning? He cannot remember. And not only that, if everything is momentary and kshanikada, then the memory of a pot and the memory of a cloth should not be distinct. A person seeing a pot and another person seeing a cloth, ghata pada, is examples in old books, Somebody who has seen a cloth, another person who has seen a pot. And both pot and a cloth are unreal. That is according to Vijnanavadins, Shunyavadins both. In that case, everything then, there cannot be any distinction between the unreality of a pot and the unreality of a cloth. Maybe slightly boring, this kind of dialectical discussion. So Shankaracharya says, Anusmurdescha. He says, because memory is there. Memory can never be explained if you accept a momentariness. Momentariness, if you extend to kind of, let us say, absence of absolute existence, it is understandable. But the problem is, Vijnanavadins and Shunyavadins, they refute even the existence of empirical existence. Remember, this again among the Buddhists who lived in the 8th century. So, when you read Shankaracharya's books or when you read Vidyaranya's Sarvadarshana Sangraha, you should remember they are describing Buddhist doctrines that may have departed from the central teachings of the original Vijnanavadins and Shunyavadins. So, Asanga and Vasubandhu were the founders of Vijnanavada, technically speaking. They popularized it, and Nagarjuna was the greatest name in Shunyavada tradition. So, for Nagarjuna, 3rd century, 2nd, 3rd century AD. Asanga, Vasubandhu, around the same time, more or less. From there to Shankara's time, almost 400, 500 years. So, a lot of changes have taken place. So, Vijnanavada and Shunyavada must have degenerated into something which is totally different from the original teachings of Buddha or the teachings of Asanga, Vasubandhu or Chandrakirti or Nagarjuna. That's why in Shankaracharya's works you find refutation of Shunyavada and Vijnanavada. So the context should be very clearly understood, the timeline should be clearly understood. This is a very important point to remember. So, because the commentary makes it very clear, not only experience, but also the experiencer, both are equally unreal. And now again, there is a very important sutra that comes after a few more sutras. Na bhava upalabdhehi. That's also in the same chapter. It's actually a refutation of Vijnanavadins of those times, 8th century, who used to argue that external objects are absolutely no existence. But again, very obviously, it is a departure from Nagarjuna's own doctrine, Loka Samburdhi Satyam Cha. Satyam Cha Paramarthataha. He said, phenomenal world, empirical world, it's also a reality. And then Paramartha Satyam, absolute reality, that is Shunyavada, that is also a reality. And he makes very clear in the coming verses that one should transcend empirical to reach the transcendental. Now, during this time, in Shankaracharya's time, there was this well-known doctrine. Na bhava ulabdhe, the sutra says, external objects have absolutely no existence. Now, that was the central doctrine of Vijnanavadins, Yogachara. They were called Yogachara because they were great experimentators, innovators in different techniques of meditation. They were masters of yoga, Patanjali yoga system and different practices. So in that respect, they came to be known as Yogacharas. And they were also, in the speculative aspect when it's emphasized, they came to be known as Vijnanavadins because they believed only awareness exists, the objects of which we are aware have absolutely no existence. So again, एवं बाह्यार्थवादमासीत्य समुदाय अप्राप्त्यादिषु दूषेण उपाविदेषु विज्ञानवादी बुद्ध इदानीं प्रत्यवतिष्ठते. Anyway, this also a very important thing. According to Advaitins, they say that there is a difference between the dream objects and waking state objects. The particular context is the context of comparing the experiences of dream state with the experiences of waking state. During waking state, we experience many things at the empirical level. During dream state also we experience, but in Vedanta, Advaitins clearly draw a line of demarcation between waking state experiences and dream state experiences. But Vijnanavadins will tell you that all waking state experiences are as unreal as dream objects, which Vedantis don't accept. So the na bhava vilabdhehe. I mean, what do you say? The idea is external objects have no non-existence, means external objects do exist. Why? Upalabdhehe. Because we are able to see things and we are able to remember things. So memory and empirical experience go together. Therefore, the doctrine of absolute non-existence of external objects as held by the Vijnanavadins cannot be supported. This is a bit of a discussion, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this. You can, if you have got any doubt, you are most welcome to answer questions. I mean, discuss this. Now, another very important point, remember. This is with regard to what we just mentioned initially at the beginning. I don't have time to go through all the 120, all the hundreds of verses of different scriptures in Shunyavada tradition or the 27 chapters of Mula Madhyama Shastra. It's an extensive work. Chandrakirti's commentary is very, very well known, and he has written a very long commentary on the first verse after the dedicatory verse. Na sodo nabi varado nadvabhyam nabi ahetugaha utpanna jadi vidyande bhava kojana kejana. In fact, Chandrakirti writes very elaborately on this verse itself, which is a very famous verse. So we don't have time to go through the entire 27 chapters, God forbid. And also people will be relieved when I tell you that we are not going to the entire text. So one important text which is very famous, which is subject to a lot of discussion, is what is called the Vodgada or the verses of dedication. Nagarjuna is not dedicating the verse to any deity as frequently you find in Vedanta texts. But he is dedicating this to him, the Buddha, who enlightened, who reached the supreme truth. So this is a well-known verse, Anirodham, Anutpannam, Anuchedam, Ashashwadam, Anegartham, Ananartham, Anagamam, Anirgamam, Yapatiti Samutpadam, Prapanjo Pashamas Shivam, Deshyamasa Sambuddha, Tam Vande Padadam Varam. So, the supreme among teachers or speakers, that's the enlightened, the fully enlightened one, Sambuddha. Tam Vande Padadam Varam. He's paying his tributes, his obeisance to the great teacher, Buddha. And then he uses actually objective case, second vibhakti, Anirodham. What is, who preach the supreme truth. What is the truth? The non-disappearing, non-ceasing, then anegartham. So anutpadam, something that doesn't come into existence. Anirodham, something that never ceases to exist. Anirodham means something that never ceases to exist. Anutpadam, something never comes into existence, never arises. And then Anuchedam, something that never gets fully annihilated, non-annihilation. So that's the point, Shunya is the central thesis of this book. And what was the central teaching of Buddha? It is Anuchedam. Anuchedam means the opposite of annihilation. Cheda means annihilation. Anuchedam. The Buddha who taught the non-annihilation. And then Ashashwadam, non-permanence. Anegartham, non-identity. Ananartham, and non-difference. And then non-appearance. Anagamam, and Anirgamam, non-disappearance. So you can find everything is refuted. It's an extension of Chaduskoti. And it is called Praditya Samutpada, Praditya Samutpada, dependent arising. And that is what Buddha taught. So he is paying his tribute to that doctrine. Something that never disappears, never comes into existence, never totally gets annihilated, never permanent, and again which has got different implications, non-identical and non-different, is non-appearance, non-disappearance. So what it means is, it is beyond all possible prepositions. This is the central teaching of Buddha. Now, Chandrakirti belonged to a group of Shunyavadins known as Prasangikas. And that was the doctrine of Prasangikas, which is slightly different from the rival school known as the Swatantrikas. Bhava Viveka, another commentator. Actually, last time when we discussed, we quoted from Bhava Viveka. So his commentary is included in the big book that I displayed in the screen later. Bhava Viveka and Buddha Pali and others. So there are two rival schools, which are somewhat different in their own interpretation of Shunyavada. According to Chandrakirti, he says that he is a follower of Aryadeva and Buddha Palida in the previous schools. Now, in this book, in this particular verses, the contents of Buddha's discourse are all referred here in the Akasiti case. For example, Anirodham, Anutpadam, etc. And then there is no indication as to whether they refer to one doctrine or not. So according to many Buddhist philosophers, this verse itself opens a lot of scope and possibilities for interpreting this Shunyavada, Madhyamika text itself in so many different ways. So now I have just finished certain important fundamental doctrines of Shunyavada, and within 2-3 more classes I shall take a few more important verses from this text, and we can have an interaction, because sometimes, you know, when we put so many ideas together in one class, it could be slightly complicated. So you can ask questions, I think better we can limit. So Bobby, you today some of these verses are highly technical. For example, the very simple, the central fact, the central point that I made today, the way Buddhism was interpreted in 8th century during Shankaracharya's time, which led to a lot of conflicts between Buddhism and Advaita, and then again a more broad-based interpretation that became popular, mostly thanks to some of the scholars who interpreted Buddhism from the later half of 19th century, mostly some of the great teachers from Japan and Sri Lanka who took initiative. So I find Professor Suzuki, one of the Dhammapala, others who played a very important role in giving a more holistic interpretation to Buddhism. Because the era of dialectical conflicts, writing books after books is contradicting the previous school, that golden era has gone. And they were all wrote in Sanskrit, in very profound Sanskrit language they wrote. That era is gone. The later half of 19th century onwards, great scholars in Europe, and also with the help of course, the scholars of original text from India, from Sri Lanka, from Japan, later on from Burma and other countries, you get a much more broad-based and balanced interpretation of Buddhist philosophy. And today there is a trend to emphasize the important point that Shunya did not imply what we mean by the English word emptiness and nothingness. It's a profound blunder and mistake which has led lot of misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was prevalent even in the 8th century, which continued right up to 13th century, the time when Vidyaranya wrote the Sarvadarsana Sangraha. It is an important book, introductory book for anyone who study comparative philosophy. You find so even Vidyaranya's views on Buddhism and Shunyavada were influenced by the popular tendency among the later Buddhists to interpret Shunya as what we in English we call nothingness or emptiness, which is actually a departure from the original teachings of Buddha. And also Nagarjuna and his commentator Chandrakirti who wrote the Prasannapada, the commentary. We can have interaction. Most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Summary, let's go further with the idea that the misunderstanding of Shunya continues to our times, because what you've done is you've gone back to the original texts and highlighted the timeline, the misunderstanding of those ancient times, and how that continues to our time.
True.
The notion that I've been living with is that the doctrine of Shunya deepens our sense of the agnosticism of Buddhist teachings, when in fact what you're suggesting is that it's literally agnostic, but in deeper spirit it is not, because the transcendence is Advaita in essence.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And it's not as though you're trying to jam Buddhism into an Advaitin perspective.
No, never.
Actually looking, never, right. You're actually looking at how the original texts support transcendence in similar language to the Advaitin ideal. Sri Ram's hand is up, so please go ahead, Sri Ram.
Yeah.
If I didn't misunderstand what you said, the Shunya is supposed to exclude the presence of anything that is eternal.
Yeah.
Does it exclude the eternal?
Yeah. You know what Nagarjuna says is the absolute reality even cannot be called eternal. To call it eternal or non-eternal, this is equally wrong. Because if you call it eternal, then it will not be eternal. So, that is true in Advaita also. The problem is, many are not familiar with the original text, either Nagarjuna's text or Shankaracharya's books. In the Shankara's commentary in Brahma Sutra I mentioned earlier, you see, if you call Aham Brahmasmi, that Mahavakya, when you say Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya, world is empirical, relative, non-absolute, and Brahman is the only absolute reality. You don't make the statement when you actually reach the experience level of that idea. You make the statement only one step below the experience level. You don't make a statement, I am Sri Ram. You don't make the statement. It's such a fact that there is no need for you to make the statement. And of course, obviously, you don't make the statement, I am not Sri Ram. You follow the point? So, in fact, Shankaracharya in his commentary makes a point. What is so obvious, you don't state it. You don't deny it. Something that is very obvious, self-evident, Swayam Pratyaksha, Swata Pratyaksha, which is a matter of inner experience. A Brahmajnani, knower of Brahman, doesn't go about shouting, I am Brahman. He is no better than a person who says, I am George, I am John, I am X, I am Y, I am Brahman. The same. He is as ignorant as a person who tells you, I am X, I am Y. Because the fact that he is Brahman becomes so much of an inner experience that he doesn't feel the need to make a statement of it. Bhashyakara says, what prasaktasya ko nishedhaga, prasaktasya ka prastavaka. Aprasaktasya ko nishedhaga, aprasaktasya ka prastavaka. What is so obvious, you don't make a statement, either affirming or negating. What is absolutely unreal, you don't make a statement, because you cannot make a statement about something that is absolutely. You don't say, you don't go about telling, I don't have two heads. But having two eggs is such an absolute impossibility. So you don't say, I don't have two heads, I have only one head. So what is self-evident is beyond definitions. So in the Chatussutri, Shankaracharya says towards the end, I am Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I know, I am a knower of Brahman. All these, the knower, the known and knowledge, that is the pramada, prameya and pramana. Subject, object and knowledge that connects the two. You transcend, you go beyond this when you reach the experience dimension of that truth. Similarly, Shunya is in fact a state of inner experience. That's what a person who experiences when he reaches nirvana as a result of practicing the eightfold disciplines, Buddhism. At that time he doesn't go about shelling. But in Buddhism itself, there are ideas, bodhi, chitta, vinyapti matrata siddhi. All these terms are used in Buddhism itself to imply that experience. But Nagarjuna emphasizes that point, it is beyond any kind of verbalization. This point very difficult to understand because our normal understanding of religion and spirituality and philosophy is, I make a statement, I believe in this, I sign, I put by signature, I am this, I am that. Like that, I did this, so I am going to heaven. I did not do this, I am going to hell. God has shown grace to me, or otherwise. These ideas are ingrained so deeply in our system that frequently we are not able to intellectually grasp the idea of going beyond words. That's an important point. I often used to refer to Meister Eckhart's concept of going beyond any kind of verbalization, any kind of definitions, any kind of even the idea of God, called Supreme Godhead reality, was beyond Holy Trinity according to Eckhart. Meister Eckhart, please remember. So, Nagarjuna is pointing out something. That's why Nagarjuna's system is added so much justice to Buddha's original doctrine. But the point is again, we translate that into an English word, nothingness, emptiness. And that gives justification to call them Mahavainasikaha, means the great annihilators. That's what they call. If you read the critical works on Vedanta, which contradicted Buddhism, they are not contradicting Buddha, they are contradicting the prevailing ideas which have gone a long distance away from Buddha's central doctrines. What Nagarjuna is telling, Loka Samvruddhi Satyam cha Paramarthadaka. Dve Satye Samuvasitya Buddhanam Lokaseshana. Means Buddha's central teaching, Dve Satye Samuvasitya. Depending upon two central truths. Buddhanam Lokaseshana. I mean Buddha's great teaching. Loka Samvruddhi Satyam. Loka Samvruddhi means empirical truth, Vyavakharika reality. What Shankaracharya called this world, empirical world, body, mind, complex, all these things. Part of Samvruddhi. Common sense, conventional reality, what we normally interact with. The reality in which we are living. We cannot deny, we are experiencing it. But you understand it is only Samvruddhi, it is only empirical, it is not absolute. That understanding is not an intellectual understanding. It is an innate inner experience that you get when you go beyond it. Before you go beyond it, you can only call it, but there is something to reach, Shankaracharya says. So at least intellectually we should understand what it means to believe in something that is transcendental, something which cannot be explained or defined or described. We should be able to do that. Well, I said just now about music. When you listen to a great music, what you are experiencing is actually a transcendental experience. You may try to give a speech of how wonderful the music was, but that description falls far short of the real experience that you are trying to explain. This again is an example from empirical life. This applies. That's why Sri Ramakrishna, even coming to our own ordinary life experiences, Sri Ramakrishna says, the sweetness of sugar cannot be explained, can only be experienced. Milk, you can write a book on milk, but drinking milk and be nourished by milk is something different. So that's what it says. So when we look at this,
while our scriptures say that the ultimate reality is Anurvachyam, there are also statements which say that it is
Mahavakyas.
Satchidananda and
I tell you, Satchidananda word. Satchidananda word is Dvaita only. Satchidananda experience is Advaita. The word Brahman is only Dvaita. You are living in this world. You are seeing a book, you are writing it. Dvaita only. You are uttering a word. You are the one who does that act of uttering a word. You hear the word. It happens only in Dvaita. You transcend all this. That is Advaita. So, the most abstract books on Advaita are also within Dvaita. But the real experience of Advaita is Advaita. Shankaracharya makes it very clear, Gaudapada makes it very clear. Shastra, teacher, Shastram, the subject you teach, Shishya, the student, all they cease to exist when you experience. That's why often you find when you learn these books from a traditional teacher, at least by listening to some fundamental central concepts of Vedanta or Buddhism, you will make a mistake. But without any of this understanding, you go on writing books, teaching in a university, saying that Buddha and Shankara were fighting on a stage. Absolute gibberish. That's a problem. That's some of the core principles of the spiritual dimension of these philosophical ideas should be grasped. Then you can read books. Otherwise you miss it. Yeah. And you have to remember about Buddhism, I tell you, Buddhism was exported from India to all these neighboring countries. Many of these countries, they learned Buddhism and they gave a localized version in course of time when to Tibet, China, Japan and Far Eastern countries. Now all over the world you can find. So it will change. But in the midst of all these cataclysmic changes, if you understand some central truth, the Buddha was aiming at some higher transcendental truth, and that truth has got a verbal dimension, which is only a prelude to its experience dimension. That's the point. So if you listen to... if you listen to, let us say, the great teachers like the present Dalai Lama, they don't interpret these things in such a very textual, prosaic way, but still you can see that reconciliatory or harmony-based approach to all that you can find. Because when you study this, when you meditate, our mind develops a skill, the ability to grasp the spiritual dimension of these great teachings. Otherwise, we may read these ideas and then you find just one verse tells you that everything is shunya, everything is empty, there is nothing in the world. It becomes a kind of radical anarchist doctrine. And Buddha was the opposite of that. Buddha was very positive. You look at his teaching, he was very positive. His approach was different. He used to ask questions, they used to correct, but his approach was very positive. Okay? Thank you for the question, for the discussion. Yeah.
Maharaj, the confusion about the Nasti, the accusation that it's Nasti as opposed to Asti.
Yeah.
I was looking at what you said about the Paramatma Sutyam.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that the same as Nirvana, or is that proximate to Nirvana in the same sense that we're looking at these commentators and their misunderstandings?
Okay, thank you. See, you give me chance to explain something which I have explained already. I mentioned earlier there are two central doctrines in Buddhism, that is Nairatmyavada the doctrine that there is no Atman, no soul, and Kshanabhangavada, the doctrine of momentariness. Now, when Buddhists talked about that there is no Atman, they were talking about Jivatman.
Okay.
That's the point. Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha, Bhasha in Vedanta. Jiva is not Jiva, but is Brahman, not different from Brahman. So, that's why, but in Buddhism itself, there are terms like Vijñapti is used, Bodhi is used, Tattva is used. All these terms implying what we call Paramatman or Brahman in Vedanta. But in the term Nairatmya, no Anattavada, the Anatta is a Pali equivalent of Anatma, non-Atman. There is no Atman. The Atman actually implies Jivatma, individual soul. The individual soul is nothing but Praditya Samutpada, dependent origination, coming and going through the cycles of life, birth, life, death and rebirth. It has no absolute existence. That's what is said in Nairatmyavada. So, that is Vijñapti Matra. That is, they say Vijñapti Matrada Siddhi. How to attain Vijñapti Matrada. It's a well-known book. So, in Buddhism, when they talked about non-Atman, that Atman is not Paramatman or Brahman, that Atman is Jivatma, individual soul.
Very clear, very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, it feels like over the last few sessions, when we really think from the highest level, that these philosophies, Advaita and Shunyavada, from the highest level, there's very little distinction. From the point of liberation, that there's not so much distinction.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what are the differences, what are the practical differences for a spiritual seeker? I feel like in Vedanta, there's a lot of emphasis on contemplating God.
Yeah.
Contemplate God, you try to understand God. But in Shunyavada, maybe there isn't as much, are you meant to contemplate voidness? Or is there a difference in practice or meditative practices between the two?
Yeah. Before you start contemplating on Shunya, you already go through the earlier stages of, recognizing the Four Noble Truths and also the 8 fundamental disciplines. When you practice these 8 fundamental disciplines, Samyak Drishti, Samyak Vyayama, Samyak Ajiva, Samyak Karma, Samyak Vak, Samyak Smriti, Samyak Samadhi. Like that, when you practice all these, your mind will reach a point which is not very different from practicing Yama Niyamas of Patanjali or the Sadhana Sadhushtaya for the important disciplines in Advaita Vedanta. We talk about Nitya Vastu Viveka, the discerning wisdom between real and unreal, disregarding the unreal, upholding the real, and then Samadhi, Sarka Sambhati, self-restraint, sense control, mind control, purity, contentment, concentration, all these qualities. When you practice all these, that's what you find in Buddha. And then there are statements in Buddhist scriptures, but Buddha himself, he admired, Buddhism was a non-Brahmanical religion, remember, technically. Buddha was a revolutionary against casteism. Some of the social problems that have crept into Hindu society over thousands of years of evolution. So remember, a society, not philosophy or spirituality. Buddha revolted against all this. The same Buddha is mentioned again and again. Ideal Brahmana is like an ideal Buddhist bhikkhu. I mentioned this many times. You can just take the book Dhammapada, very simple book, the 26th chapter. The title is Brahmana Varga, the chapter dealing with the, maybe you have a computer in front of you. You have seen that? Brahmana Vargas, Dhammapada, chapter 25. It's called Brahmana Varga. Brahmana here is not priest doing puja in a temple. Brahmana here means a highly evolved person. That's the meaning of it. That's the literal meaning of it. If you know Sanskrit, you will understand. That's the literal meaning of Brahmana. Not somebody belonging to a caste. Absolutely. Totally different. So now, what Buddha says, he is a wise man. You read that Brahmana Varga, 26th chapter. Him tam bruhi brahmanam. Many of the verses end with tam bruhi brahmanam. Him I call a brahmana. That's how it ends. Him I call a wise man. Him I call an enlightened person. All these qualities you find. That's what you find in Gita. A spiritually enlightened person, illumined person. The second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, 55th verse of Gita, second chapter, to 72nd verse. The characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person. In Sanskrit called Siddhaprajna Lakshanas. The characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person. All the same. See, you see what Buddha has to speak about a spiritually enlightened person. So you find all these in many of the Hindu scriptures also. Bhagavata Purana and others. So if you take Buddha's judgment, way of judging, Christ was a Brahmana. Buddha himself was born in a Kshatriya family, was a Brahmana. Any spiritually enlightened person anywhere in the world is a Brahmana. That's the meaning Buddha gives to that. So you can see how universal he was. But then you bring that Buddha down to the level of an anarchist by saying he taught total annihilation, total nothingness. You can find the great nothingness, the great emptiness. Buddha will collapse if he reads the translation into modern English. Of course, you cannot blame. There are sincere seekers, sincere students who try to popularize Buddha's teaching with noble intention. And the problem of language, you cannot blame anyone for that. But somebody should explain this. Yeah.
Maharaj, I think if I recall correctly, you said that some of the Buddhist canon was rescued through translation in other locations and then ricocheted back to India, where it got reestablished after it was translated into the East Asian languages. Yeah. And so I have a question about whether or not the traditional Buddhist schools are substantially the same or perhaps different from Brahmanical schools in India because of the journey that Buddhism took.
Yeah, that's true. Many of the Buddhist scholars who wrote these extensive works in Sanskrit were converted Brahmins. Nagarjuna, Dinnaga, Vasubandhu, Chandrakirti, Asanga, all of them, both the Vijnanavadins, Shunyavadins, also, they were all converted Brahmin scholars. So, it seems to me that, of course, if you look at the great teachers of Buddhism in the central seats of Buddhist monasteries, you can find they all practiced some of these great virtues of Buddhism, like the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths are a matter of conviction, but the Eightfold Discipline is something that you literally practice. If you practice these Eightfold Disciplines, then you can't help being a genuine, compassionate human being. Because that's what you find outlined in the Eightfold Discipline, Buddhism. Right conduct, right action, right livelihood, right memory, right view, right concentration, all these, right speech. Of course, we have to read little more than just the list, And you find there is so much of non-violence, compassion, other human virtues implied in each one of these 8 disciplines. Now, if you practice these 8 disciplines, then literally you become the Brahmana as expounded by Dhammapada in the 26th chapter. Compassion, self-control. Yeah.
So the students are actually experiencing the same kinds of disciplines as any spiritual tradition.
Any spiritual tradition, precisely. In any tradition spiritually. In fact, that's what happens to somebody, the desert fathers, if you take, or the great mystics, if you take. Of course, one difference is, in all these traditions, there was the idea of an anthropomorphic God and the concept of heaven and getting ready to go to that heaven. And for that you practice these great spiritual virtues quality. That's wonderful. Still, when you practice them, you become a good human being. That's what. So it's so universal. Buddha's teachings are so universal, really speaking. So the same monks who were living in Dead Sea and back to Dead Sea, according to some schools, they were Buddhist. According to some schools, they were all Hinayana, Theravada schools. We don't know, of course. So, it is so universal. The same as Yama and the Yamas in Patanjali and elsewhere.
Exactly.
Vedanta. Same thing. That's what happens. And also when you go to the Egyptian desert, as a desert fathers, you do same. Or when you meditate in a Christian monastery, if you're a genuine spiritual seeker, you get the same experience. You become a good, compassionate human being.
The traditional Jewish yeshivas also likewise. So.
I like to compare these with the contrasting examples in Buddhist Karma, which comes to me again and again. There is a Father Ferapond who sees devils everywhere. He says, yesterday I killed 10 devils because I was closing the door. So the 10 devils caught, their tails were caught and I killed them, he says in Buddhist Karma. He's a half crazy man who goes about telling absolute rubbish. But there's a great sage, Father Zosima, who resembles some of ancient Vedic sages, who was a man of compassion like Buddha. So you can see the two examples.
Hello, my follow-up is, so you mentioned this in Bhagavad Gita class.
Yeah.
There's this similarity between that section in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita and Dhammapada, which is, it says a lot of different things, but a lot of it is about restricting your attachment, restricting the senses from a lot of different attachments, and that really is such a critical step, right? And now I'm looking at and I think my question on the differences in practice, I'm just looking at verse 59 of chapter 2 in the Gita, and it talks about, it says Rasa varjam raso pyasya
Param drishtva nivartade. Yeah.
So it's so it talks about this higher taste, right? This param rasa, right? Which I think when you read Bhagavad Gita, you say this higher taste is God. It's this very...
Yeah.
I guess it's a positive thing. It's it's something you can develop a very positive, universal association around versus Shunya feels... Is there something like this in Buddhism? When there isn't an emphasis on God, what is the higher taste?
Buddhism doesn't speak about any creator God.
Yes.
Meditation or prayer to a deity, anything like that. But there again, rasavarjam rasopitya param drishtva nivartade. So actually when you reach the highest, when you get a vision of the highest reality, param drishtva, then what happens is all our taste and desires and tendencies and instincts for worldly things get completely transcendent. You transcend completely all the worldly entanglements. That's a implication. Now, that's what really happens when you practice Eightfold Disciplines in Buddhism. So, if you practice Eightfold Disciplines, our mind acquires the necessary qualities and then we are able to grasp the Supreme Truth at a different level, not as an intellectual concept, not as an idea, but as a fact. And again, I tell you, when we practice certain spiritual disciplines, that will help them to understand certain intellectual concepts in spiritual literature in a much more intimate manner than otherwise. Spiritual disciplines, like self-restraint, self-control, meditation, prayer, all these, can develop certain unique qualities in our mind. And with that, if you read a scripture, you understand certain aspects of the concepts in a scripture better than otherwise. Because these meditations, or without meditation, if you will live a good life, that itself develops a spiritual asset, a spiritual energy and certain qualities, and those qualities will help us to grasp intellectually some of the great truths mentioned in scriptures or even in books on philosophy, to be very frank. It's a fact. Because what we do or what we don't do will have an influence on the mind. Our mind is always thinking about, is crowded with thoughts and emotions which are always intertwined with what we do, what we speak. We can never separate our mind and thoughts in our mind from what we do. So if our actions involve certain spiritual disciplines, then actually the mind develops certain qualities. And these additional qualities will give the mind a unique capacity to understand spiritual truths, again, even at the very intellectual level. For example, when you read, I just mentioning Dostoevsky. I am a devoted Hindu. So I don't even know the original language. But from a spiritual perspective, if you read Brothers Karamazov, you come across a character like Father Zosima, then you naturally are reminded of some great sages in ancient Hindu tradition, Puranas or Upanishads or anything. But you don't find it difficult to relate, because these spiritual qualities will help us to bring down the boundaries of culture, language and other things. So that's why great spiritual people will not fail to understand great spiritual truths in all books, any book, in any tradition. Because it opens the mind to, it develops in our mind certain higher qualities. And narrow ideas, fanatical ideas will make the mind narrow. And with that mind, you cannot grasp higher things. You have done wonderful examples even in today's world. But narrow ideas, tribal ideas, tribalistic ideas can have very negative effect on our perspective of the world. So that's why it's very important. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Maharaj,
Yeah.
Well, you spoke this morning about Swami Tattwamayananda in
Yeah.
the context of Shanti Ashrama,
Yeah,
because we have our annual event there later. And this idea of the essential holiness of a life like that,
Yeah.
it just seems so resonant with what you just said.
Yeah.
That these ideas of connection,
Yeah.
of that sort, just seems so universal.
Besides, exactly.
It would easily bridge the gap,
Yeah.
or if there is any gap, between Swami Tattwamayananda and Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Precisely. Absolutely. How do you explain otherwise these people who had never had any access to Eastern spiritual tradition get inspiration to go to that wild, remote place and live there, and Turiyanandaji imposed strict disciplines. And that too, remember at that time it was, the place was quite remote compared to what it is now. So, there's, again you have to remember, the effect of sowing the seed depends upon the quality of the soil also. In the soil of the seed parable, it is the soil that is predominant, not the seed. The seed, if it falls on rocks and thistles and thorns, it won't sprout. So the quality of the soil is the deciding factor in the parable, Jesus' parable of the sower of the seed. So soil is very important. Don't you think so, Bobby?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, the idea that the Americans that joined Turiyanandaji in this remote place,
absolutely,
that they were living in community in this first ashram, with those disciplines, as they sought to go higher and did, is proof of what you're speaking of tonight. Om
Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.